Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about something fundamental to human interaction: emotion, conflict, and the paradox of attraction. You see, human beings are extraordinarily complex creatures. We are driven by instinct, by social conditioning, by fear, and ultimately by our yearning for connection. Now, imagine a man who finds himself drawn to someone, perhaps you, and yet rather than pursuing this feeling with clarity and purpose, he wrestles with it. He suppresses it. Why? Because emotion, particularly deep-seated attraction, disrupts the carefully structured order he has imposed upon himself. So let's break this down. How do you know if a man is fighting his feelings for you? Well, you have to understand the psychological framework underpinning his behavior. People often assume that emotions are straightforward. If someone likes you, they'll express it openly, and if they don't, they won't. But human psychology is far more intricate than that. Denial is one of the most powerful psychological mechanisms, and it plays a fundamental role in how people process emotions, especially when those emotions feel disruptive to their sense of order, control, or identity. A man might find himself drawn to someone, yet instead of embracing that attraction, he suppresses it. Why would he do this? The answer lies in the tension between emotion and logic, between the self that desires connection and the self that fears its consequences. People suppress their emotions for several reasons, but at the core, it often comes down to vulnerability. To acknowledge deep emotions means exposing oneself to risk, the risk of rejection, of change, of losing control over one's carefully constructed world. And if there's one thing people fear, it's uncertainty. From a psychological perspective, denial serves as a protective function. It allows a person to compartmentalize emotions that feel overwhelming or inconvenient. Men, in particular, are often socialized to suppress their emotions rather than express them. In many cultures, emotional restraint is equated with strength, and vulnerability is perceived as weakness. As a result, when a man experiences strong feelings for someone, especially unexpectedly, he might instinctively fight against them rather than acknowledge them. One of the key ways this manifests is through avoidance behavior. The mind, in its attempt to maintain equilibrium, pushes away what it perceives as a threat to its stability. If a man finds himself growing emotionally attached, he might start avoiding the person who triggers those emotions. He might be less responsive, withdraw from conversations, or even create physical distance. This isn't because he lacks feelings, it's precisely the opposite. The stronger the emotion, the greater the internal resistance. Ironically, this avoidance often coexists with moments of deep engagement. A man fighting his feelings might oscillate between being distant and being highly attentive. This push-pull dynamic is a psychological defense mechanism. When he withdraws, he is trying to regain control, convincing himself that he isn't as emotionally invested as he actually is. But because emotions aren't easily suppressed, they resurface, leading to moments where he re-engages intensely. He might seek out opportunities to be near the person he is trying to avoid, not realizing that his actions contradict his conscious efforts to distance himself. Another reason people fight their feelings is unresolved past experiences. If a man has previously experienced emotional pain, perhaps from rejection, betrayal, or loss, he may unconsciously associate deep feelings with potential suffering. His mind tells him that allowing himself to feel again means risking another wound. In this case, suppression becomes a form of self-preservation. He believes that by refusing to acknowledge his emotions, he is protecting himself from possible heartbreak. The problem with this approach is that emotions don't simply disappear. They linger beneath the surface, influencing behavior in subtle yet undeniable ways. There's also the factor of external expectations. If a man perceives that admitting his feelings will complicate his life in ways he isn't ready to handle, he may try to suppress them. Perhaps he believes that being in a relationship at this stage of his life would distract him from his career goals. Perhaps he feels societal or familial pressure to act in a certain way. If the relationship dynamic doesn't align with his expectations, such as workplace connections, social barriers, or differences in personal values, he may view his emotions as irrational and attempt to override them with logic. Yet, despite all attempts at suppression, the truth often reveals itself through unconscious cues. The body has its own way of communicating what the mind tries to ignore. Prolonged eye contact, physical proximity, small gestures of care, these are often indicators of emotions that words do not express. The more a person fights against their feelings, the more those feelings manifest in unexpected ways. Frustration, irritability, or even jealousy can emerge, not because the person intends to be reactive, but because unacknowledged emotions create inner conflict. What's important to understand is that denial is not sustainable. A person can suppress emotions temporarily, but eventually those emotions demand recognition. The question then becomes, what happens when the truth can no longer be ignored? Does he acknowledge his feelings and take action, or does he continue to resist, allowing the internal struggle to persist? The answer depends on his level of self-awareness, emotional maturity, and willingness to confront his own vulnerabilities. The healthiest approach to emotions is not to suppress them, but to integrate them into one's understanding of the self. Acknowledging feelings does not mean acting on them impulsively, nor does it mean letting them dictate one's decisions. Rather, it means recognizing their presence, understanding their origin, and making conscious choices based on both emotion and reason. For someone who recognizes that a man is fighting his feelings, patience and clarity are essential. Pressuring him to admit his emotions before he is ready may backfire, as it can increase his resistance. Instead, giving him the space to process his feelings while maintaining open and honest communication can create an environment where he feels safe enough to acknowledge his emotions on his own terms. Ultimately, emotional suppression is a reflection of an internal struggle, not a lack of feeling. The more one tries to suppress emotions, the more they find ways to surface, often in unpredictable ways. It is only through self-awareness and acceptance that a person can move from denial to clarity, from resistance to resolution. Behavior is rarely as straightforward as it seems, especially when it comes to human emotions. People often assume that if someone is interested in them, they will consistently seek out their company, make their intentions clear, and express their feelings without hesitation. But this overlooks a fundamental truth about human psychology. Attraction, particularly when it is unexpected or unwanted, often creates internal conflict. When someone is fighting their feelings, their actions tend to be contradictory, revealing an ongoing struggle between what they feel and what they believe they should do. One of the most telling signs of this internal battle is the way a man positions himself in relation to the person he is drawn to. He may not openly express his emotions, but his behavior patterns expose the inconsistency of his intentions. He might deliberately avoid direct interactions, but at the same time, he keeps finding excuses to be in the same space as the person he is trying to resist. He may show up at social gatherings where he knows she will be, take routes that bring him near her, or even remain in the background of conversations, seemingly disinterested yet never too far away. His presence is not accidental, but rather a subconscious pull that he himself may not fully understand. The contradiction extends to communication. He might respond coldly at times, appearing indifferent or even dismissive, but then, when circumstances allow, he suddenly becomes engaged, interested, and present. If he were genuinely uninterested, his behavior would be consistent. He would either maintain emotional distance or remain completely neutral. Instead, what happens is an oscillation between avoidance and engagement. This is the mind's way of balancing the desire for connection with the need to maintain emotional control. Another indication of this struggle is the way he reacts to other people's attention toward the person he is drawn to. If he were truly indifferent, he would not be affected by others taking an interest in her. But when someone is suppressing their emotions, they often react in subtle yet revealing ways. He may not express overt jealousy, but his mood might shift when another person captures her attention. He might make indirect comments, subtly interrupt conversations, or find ways to steer her focus back to him, even if only for a moment. This behavior is not necessarily conscious. It is an automatic response to the discomfort of seeing someone else occupy a space that he has been trying to deny his own desire for. There is also a distinct pattern in how he interacts with her compared to others. If he is generally outgoing, he may become noticeably reserved around her. If he is naturally reserved, he may overcompensate with excessive confidence. Either way, there is a shift in demeanor that betrays his efforts to maintain control over his emotions. A man fighting his feelings will often either downplay their significance or act as if they do not exist at all, but the more he tries to prove his indifference, the more obvious the internal contradiction becomes. This struggle often leads to moments of unexpected emotional intensity. He may be distant for days, only to suddenly engage in a deep conversation that reveals more than he intended. He might be restrained in group settings, but in one-on-one moments, he allows glimpses of vulnerability to surface. These inconsistencies do not happen randomly. They are evidence of an ongoing internal negotiation between emotional suppression and emotional expression. His subconscious behaviors are even more revealing. People who are suppressing emotions often exhibit micro-expressions, fleeting changes in facial expressions that betray their true feelings before they regain composure. He may glance at her longer than he should, only to quickly look away. His body might orient toward her in a room, even when he is not actively engaging with her. He may lean in slightly when she speaks, mirroring her gestures without even realizing he is doing it. These nonverbal cues are difficult to fake because they originate from a deeper part of the psyche that does not respond to logic or self-discipline in the same way conscious actions do. This behavioral contradiction is not necessarily about deception, it is about self-preservation. Many people suppress their feelings because they fear the potential consequences of acknowledging them. They may believe that acting on these emotions will lead to complications, whether personal, professional, or social. If they see the relationship as one that carries risk, perhaps due to workplace dynamics, past heartbreak, or unresolved personal struggles, they will attempt to maintain control by suppressing their emotions. But no matter how strong the effort, the subconscious still finds ways to reveal the truth. What makes this contradiction so frustrating for the person on the receiving end is the unpredictability. One moment, he may act as though she is just another person in his life, and the next, he may display an unexpected level of attentiveness, warmth, or protectiveness. This unpredictability is not an attempt to be manipulative. It is simply the natural result of an internal conflict that has not yet been resolved. For those observing this behavior, the key is not to jump to conclusions based on any single moment, but rather to look at the larger pattern. If a man's actions consistently contradict his words, if he is always on the periphery of someone's life, yet insists he has no interest, if his body language and emotional reactions betray a different reality than what he verbally expresses, then it is highly likely that he is engaged in a struggle between his emotions and his perception of what he should do. In the end, people who fight their feelings do so because they are wrestling with something larger than just attraction. They are battling their own fears, insecurities, and deeply ingrained beliefs about vulnerability and control. Whether or not they eventually accept their emotions depends on their ability to recognize that suppression is not the same as resolution. Until they come to terms with that truth, their actions will continue to contradict their intentions, creating a pattern of behavior that speaks louder than words ever could. Many men grow up with the belief that emotions, especially romantic ones, must be controlled, managed, or even suppressed. They are taught, either implicitly or explicitly, that expressing deep feelings is a sign of weakness, a loss of control, or a deviation from the rational, goal-oriented mindset that society often associates with masculinity. As a result, When a man finds himself developing strong feelings for someone, he may instinctively resist them, fearing that acknowledging them would disrupt the equilibrium he has worked so hard to maintain. This resistance is not always conscious. The human mind has an incredible ability to compartmentalize emotions, pushing aside thoughts and feelings that do not align with a person's perceived identity or goals. A man who has trained himself to be emotionally self-sufficient may view attraction or deep emotional attachment as a vulnerability, something that exposes him to the risk of rejection, emotional pain, or even failure. So rather than confronting his emotions head-on, he fights them, convincing himself that they do not exist or that they are insignificant. One of the primary reasons men suppress their emotions is the fear of losing control. Control is a deeply ingrained aspect of the masculine psyche. Control over one's actions, one's ambitions, and most importantly, one's emotions. A man who values self-discipline and rationality may view deep emotional attachment as something unpredictable, something that threatens his carefully constructed sense of order. He may feel that admitting his feelings would make him susceptible to irrational decisions, or that it would shift his focus away from the things he considers most important in life, such as his career, ambitions, or personal growth. This internal conflict often manifests in avoidance behavior. The mind, in its attempt to maintain control, pushes away the very thing that disrupts it. A man fighting his emotions might become distant, disengaging from the person he is drawn to, not because he lacks feelings, but precisely because his feelings are too strong. He may avoid conversations, limit eye contact, or even withdraw from social situations where she is present. This withdrawal is not an indication of disinterest, but rather a protective mechanism, an attempt to suppress emotions before they become overwhelming. However, emotions are not so easily controlled. The more one tries to suppress them, the more they find ways to surface. This is why avoidance is often followed by moments of unexpected attentiveness. The same man who distances himself may suddenly become hyper-aware of the person he is trying to ignore. He may find himself drawn into conversations with her, offering support, advice, or unexpected acts of kindness. These moments of engagement are not random. They are the subconscious mind's way of reconciling the suppression of emotion with the undeniable reality of its existence. Another reason men fight their emotions is past experiences. If a man has been hurt before, if he has faced rejection, betrayal, or emotional turmoil, he may associate deep feelings with pain. His subconscious mind tells him that allowing himself to feel again is a risk, a potential gateway to another heartbreak. He may even develop a belief that emotional attachment leads to vulnerability, and vulnerability leads to suffering. As a result, he convinces himself that it is better to resist than to embrace, better to suppress than to take the risk of being hurt again. In many cases, societal expectations play a role in emotional suppression. From an early age, many men are conditioned to believe that expressing emotions, especially romantic ones, should be done sparingly, if at all. They are taught to be logical, to be strong, to be providers rather than emotional beings. These deeply ingrained beliefs can make it difficult for a man to openly acknowledge his feelings, even to himself. He may struggle with the idea that being emotionally invested in someone means relinquishing control, making himself vulnerable, or even appearing weak. Despite all efforts to suppress emotions, the truth often reveals itself in nonverbal ways. The body, unlike the mind, is not as easily controlled. A man who is fighting his feelings may exhibit unconscious behaviors that betray his true emotions. He may glance at her when he thinks she isn't looking, position himself near her even when he doesn't intend to, or exhibit subtle protective instincts such as stepping in when she is uncomfortable or offering help without being asked. These behaviors are not calculated. They emerge naturally because emotions, no matter how much they are suppressed, always seek an outlet. This internal struggle can also lead to emotional inconsistency. He may be warm and engaged one moment, then cold and distant the next. This back and forth behavior is a sign of an unresolved internal conflict. His rational mind is telling him to stay in control, while his emotional mind is pulling him toward her. The inconsistency is not an indication of manipulation, but rather an internal negotiation, a subconscious attempt to find balance between feeling and restraint. For those who find themselves in a situation where a man is fighting his feelings, the most important thing to remember is that this struggle is his own. It is not a reflection of the other person's worth, nor is it a deliberate attempt to create confusion or frustration. It is simply the result of a deeply ingrained psychological mechanism, one that is trying to reconcile emotion with self-perception. Ultimately, the suppression of emotion is not a sustainable strategy. A man can fight his feelings for a time, but emotions do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They persist, they manifest in unexpected ways, and eventually they demand to be acknowledged. The question is not whether he has feelings, it is whether he has the courage to accept them, because true strength is not found in suppression, but in the willingness to confront emotions honestly, to embrace vulnerability, and to recognize that the most meaningful connections in life come not from control, but from authenticity. When a man is struggling with his feelings, one of the most revealing aspects of his behavior is how he reacts when other men show interest in the woman he is emotionally drawn to. Even if he tries to convince himself that his feelings are under control, or that he does not care, his subconscious reactions often tell a different story. Human emotions, particularly those related to attraction and attachment, are not easily controlled. They manifest in ways that can be subtle, yet undeniable. A man who is actively fighting his emotions will often attempt to maintain a sense of emotional detachment. He may tell himself that his feelings are irrelevant, that he has no right to care, or that his emotions should not influence his actions. But the moment another man enters the picture, a shift occurs. He may not vocalize his discomfort, but his body language, his mood, and his engagement in the situation will likely change. And even if he does not consciously recognize his reaction, those around him might notice small but significant signs of unease. One of the most common responses in this situation is an increase in attentiveness. A man who was previously distant, indifferent, or preoccupied with other things may suddenly become more aware of what is happening around him. He may listen more intently to conversations, track interactions between the woman and the other man, or subtly adjust his body language to position himself closer to her. These behaviors are not always intentional, but they are revealing. They stem from an instinctual response to perceived competition, a subconscious recognition that someone else is stepping into a space he has been resisting but has not yet been willing to give up. His reaction may also manifest in protective behaviors. He might make small but noticeable efforts to steer the conversation in a different direction, subtly insert himself into interactions, or find ways to keep her attention on him rather than on the other man. He may downplay the qualities of the other man, either through light teasing, sarcasm, or dismissive remarks. These behaviors are not necessarily aggressive or overt, but they indicate an internal conflict. His emotions are being challenged, and his subconscious is responding before his conscious mind can intervene. Jealousy in this context does not always look like the stereotypical displays of possessiveness or overt discomfort. In many cases, it is far more controlled, manifesting in small behavioral shifts that only become obvious when viewed in patterns over time. A man who is trying to suppress his emotions may not even realize why he feels irritated or distracted when another man is around, but his actions will often betray him. He might become quieter than usual, his humor might take on a sharper edge, or he might suddenly find reasons to leave the situation altogether. The inconsistency in his behavior is what makes this reaction so revealing. If he truly felt nothing, there would be no noticeable change. The struggle intensifies when he sees that the woman responds positively to another man's attention. If she appears engaged, interested, or receptive to the other man's presence, he may experience a deeper internal reaction. His rational mind might tell him that he has no right to care, that he has no claim over her. and that his feelings should not dictate his actions. But at the same time, his emotions will push against this logic, creating a sense of discomfort that he cannot easily ignore. He may find himself making excuses for why the other man is not a good fit for her or why she should be cautious. His protective instincts might emerge, leading him to subtly discourage her interest without making his own emotions obvious. In some cases, the discomfort of seeing another man in that space may push him to temporarily abandon his emotional restraint. He might become more engaged, more talkative, or more physically present than he usually is. This is not necessarily a conscious strategy. It is simply an automatic response to feeling like he is losing something he has not yet acknowledged wanting. The fear of loss often brings clarity to emotions that were previously denied or ignored. Until he is confronted with the possibility of someone else stepping into the role he has been resisting, he may not fully recognize the depth of his own feelings. For a man who is deeply committed to maintaining control over his emotions, this situation presents a serious dilemma. He may oscillate between withdrawal and engagement, unsure of whether to step forward or retreat entirely. The frustration of this internal struggle may even cause him to act in ways that contradict his usual personality. He might become irritated over small things, display unexpected bursts of emotion, or seem unusually preoccupied. These reactions are not intentional, but they are an indication that his feelings are no longer as neatly contained as he once believed. If he has been suppressing his emotions for a long time, witnessing someone else's interest in her may serve as a tipping point. It forces him to confront a reality that he has been avoiding, that his emotions exist, that they matter, and that ignoring them will not make them disappear. In some cases, this realization pushes him toward acceptance. He may finally acknowledge that he has feelings and begin to act accordingly. In other cases, he may double down on his resistance, convincing himself that he should not feel the way he does. Either way, his reaction to competition reveals the truth of his emotions, even if he is not yet ready to admit it. Ultimately, a man's reaction to another man showing interest in the woman he is drawn to is one of the clearest indications of whether he has been fighting his feelings. If he truly felt nothing, he would remain unaffected. But when his emotions are real, they will surface, even against his will. It is in these moments, when logic and emotion come into direct conflict, that the truth becomes undeniable. Whether he chooses to act on his feelings or continue resisting them is a different question, but his reaction itself speaks louder than words ever could. When a man is fighting his feelings, one of the clearest ways this internal struggle manifests is through his emotional inconsistency. His actions, words, and even his overall demeanor seem to shift unpredictably, leaving those around him uncertain about where he truly stands. One moment he is warm, attentive, and engaged, making it seem as though he is fully present and emotionally available. The next, he withdraws, becomes distant, or even seems cold. This back-and-forth behavior is not a conscious game, but rather a byproduct of the unresolved conflict between his emotions and his attempt to suppress them. At the core of this inconsistency is the battle between logic and emotion. He may have convinced himself that he should not develop deep feelings for her, perhaps due to past experiences, personal goals, or societal expectations. But emotions do not operate on logic. They emerge naturally, independent of one's plans or rational justifications. So when he finds himself drawn to her, engaging in deep conversations, enjoying her presence, or feeling a sense of comfort around her, his emotional mind takes over. In these moments, he allows himself to feel, and this is when he is the most open and genuine. However, once he becomes aware of his own emotional openness, his logical mind steps in to reassert control. He pulls away, creating distance as a way to regain composure. He may suddenly become less responsive to texts, take longer to reply, or make excuses for why he cannot spend time together. This withdrawal is not necessarily about a loss of interest. It is often an attempt to counteract the emotions he fears will take hold if he does not actively resist them. The cycle continues. After distancing himself, he feels the weight of absence. He may realize that he misses her presence, her laughter, or the way she makes him feel. So he re-engages, initiating conversation, seeking her out, or making an effort to be around her again. In these moments, he may act as though nothing happened, as though his prior withdrawal was insignificant. This re-engagement is not manipulation, but rather an unconscious reaction to the fact that suppressing his feelings does not make them disappear. Over time, this pattern of closeness and distance can become frustrating for both himself and those around him. The woman involved may feel confused, unsure of where she stands, and hesitant to fully invest because she senses his inconsistency. At the same time, he may feel frustrated with himself, unable to fully understand why he is behaving this way. The more he fights his feelings, the stronger they seem to become. Yet his instinct remains to retreat whenever he feels he is losing control over them. His inconsistency may also extend to the way he communicates. There are moments when he is expressive, sharing personal stories, opening up about his thoughts, and creating a genuine emotional connection. These conversations often feel effortless, as though he is finally allowing himself to be vulnerable. But later, he may suddenly become guarded, offering short responses or avoiding deep discussions altogether. This shift is not because he has lost interest, but because he recognizes that these conversations make him feel exposed, and he instinctively pulls back to protect himself. The push and pull dynamic may also play out in how he interacts physically. There may be moments when he instinctively moves closer, leaning in when she speaks, finding small excuses for physical contact, or unconsciously mirroring her movements. But later, he may create physical distance, avoiding any gestures that could suggest emotional closeness. His body, like his emotions, is caught between two opposing forces: the natural inclination to connect and the conditioned response to resist. If he is particularly self-aware, he may even recognize this pattern in himself, though that does not necessarily mean he knows how to stop it. He may feel guilty for the confusion he is causing or frustrated by his inability to simply make a clear decision, but emotional battles are rarely solved through simple logic. He may tell himself to move on, to maintain control, or to stop feeling a certain way, yet his actions will always betray his true emotions. The most significant aspect of this emotional inconsistency is that it is unsustainable. No one can indefinitely fight against their own emotions without consequence. The cycle of withdrawal and return eventually becomes exhausting, not just for the woman involved, but for the man himself. He may reach a point where he is forced to make a decision, either to accept his emotions and act on them, or to walk away entirely to preserve the illusion of control. The outcome depends on his willingness to confront his fears, to embrace vulnerability, and to recognize that emotional suppression does not lead to emotional resolution. Ultimately, emotional inconsistency is one of the clearest indicators that a man is fighting his feelings. If he truly felt nothing, his behavior would be steady and predictable, but the fluctuations in his actions, mood, and engagement reveal the underlying conflict. He is caught between what he feels and what he believes he should feel, and until he resolves this battle within himself, his behavior will remain inconsistent, reflecting the uncertainty that exists within his own heart. When a man is fighting his feelings, his actions, words, and emotions become a reflection of an internal battle that he may not fully understand himself. His need for control, fear of vulnerability, past experiences, and societal expectations all play a role in his hesitation to embrace what he truly feels. He may withdraw, become inconsistent, act possessively without realizing it, or suppress his emotions under the guise of logic and detachment. But emotions are not easily silenced. They persist, manifesting in unconscious behaviors, conflicting actions, and moments of undeniable clarity. The truth is, suppressing emotions does not eliminate them. It only prolongs the inevitable confrontation between what the heart feels and what the mind tries to deny. A man who fights his feelings is not void of them. Quite the opposite. His struggle is proof of their intensity. His actions may create confusion, but they are not random. They are signs of an internal resistance, an attempt to maintain control over something that was never meant to be controlled in the first place. The most important lesson here is that real strength does not come from avoidance. It comes from courage. The courage to acknowledge emotions, to embrace vulnerability, and to understand that feeling deeply is not a weakness, but a fundamental part of being human. True emotional maturity is not about suppressing what one feels, but about facing those feelings with honesty and integrity. Because at the end of the day, the greatest risk is not in accepting emotions. It is in losing something meaningful simply because one was too afraid to admit the truth.